Hello and welcome to this tutorial all about how to make a cushion cover from hexagons using the English paper piecing technique. The first thing you need to do is work out how big you want your cushion cover to be, because you can make any size you want, and also think about what size hexagons you want to use. I've used 1-inch hexagons and I knew that I needed a cushion cover that was about 14 inches square. So I laid out my hexagons to figure out how many that I needed, but like I say, you can make it any size. And I decided to join them together in rows because I was going for a gradient effect with the fabrics. And I also decided to join them together with the straight side at the top, but you could of course put them on point. But we'll talk more about that later on. So first of all, when you know how many hexagons and what size you want to make this out of, because you can do any size, then you need to prepare them. You could use paper templates, but I'm using Hexiform templates because that makes it even easier. Hexiform has a fuzzy side and it also has a smooth side, and it is a fabric designed to be left in. Here are some paper shapes, they're jewel shapes. I'm also going to make a cushion cover out of these. I've joined them together to make hearts. So I just thought I'd show you to show a comparison between the two, but of course paper will need to be removed. So when you've decided whether you're using paper or Hexiform, you can then baste your shapes. So I like to glue baste, so I put a dab of glue on the fuzzy side of the Hexiform and then place it down on the wrong side of my fabric shape, which is cut 1/4 inch bigger than the template. And then I just put a dab of glue slightly away from the edge, and then I fold my seam allowance over. And this is exactly the same whether you're using paper or Hexiform, and I have a video all about glue basting which I'll link above. I'm actually using pre-cut hexagons from Ava and Neve, but if you're cutting them yourself, just make sure you give yourself enough seam allowance. So these have 1/4 inch, but if you prefer you could make your seam allowance a little bit bigger to give you a little bit more wiggle room. So once you've prepared your hexagons, you can then lay them out to make sure you like the positioning and the placement of the fabric. Like I said before, I'm doing mine in rows, and I did the first few rows of the cushion ahead of time, and this is one of the final rows. So I've just placed them like that, and now I'm ready to stitch them together. I'm using cotton thread, I'm using a Fina, it's a 60 weight thread, so it's really nice and fine, but not too fine that it will snap. I really like this thread and it's made by Wonderfil. And I'm just joining my hexagons together now using a whip stitch, and again I have a video all about this in more detail and I'll link that as well. But it's really simple, you just want to catch a few threads of the fabric each time, but always begin with a knot. I think that's a really important point. Every time you get to a corner, just make a loop and put your needle through it to secure it, and that will really help make sure that nothing comes undone. So just a simple whip stitch from one corner to the other. So once I've joined two of them together, I then carry my thread along the back, so I don't cut my thread here. I do a couple of tacking stitches along the seam allowance, and because I'm using Hexiform, this is not going to show on the front at all. If you were using paper, which would be removed, there is a chance you might see the stitches a little bit, especially if you're using the fine Liberty Tana lawn that I'm using here. So just be mindful of that. But I like to carry my thread across, it's quicker, and also I think the less that you break your thread between the hexagons, the less chance there is for anything to come undone. So I feel like it gives it more stability and more security by not breaking the thread, and of course it's faster too. So once your rows are done, you can then arrange them to make sure you like the placement of everything, and then it will be time to join the rows to each other. So again, really straightforward, line them up, start at the beginning and join each seam together. The same principles apply. Do a locking knot stitch at each corner point and whip stitch along. Really, it's simple and relaxing and enjoyable to do. So once you've finished one seam, you just need to bend and manipulate the pieces to get them lined up so you can sew along the next seam. And with Hexiform, that's really easy to do because it's flexible. With paper, it's a little bit more difficult, although it isn't tricky, but you will need to bend the paper a little bit, and that's absolutely fine. It's not going to affect the patchwork at all. But you just need to bend and line up the corners, get everything nice and straight. So here's my finished panel, and as you can see, I have some gaps at the top and there are gaps at the sides. So because I've joined them together in this orientation where there is the flat side at the top, then I have some gaps here which can be filled really easily with half hexagon shapes. Of course you could trim it, but that creates waste and I really don't like doing that, so I prefer to base some half hexagons. You can either buy half hexagon shapes or you can cut your hexagons in half. It's really easy to do, and I really prefer to do this. I like to fill in the gaps and keep everything together because you are going to lose 1/4 of an inch in your seam allowance anyway, so if you were to trim those top hexagons down to meet the other ones and be on a level, you're then going to lose 1/4 of an inch on top of that, so it will really shorten your cushion. So I like to fill in the gaps, and again, really easy, baste your shapes and then just do exactly the same as before, line them up, line the corners up and stitch them into place. You can see that I'm using red thread now. I like to use red thread when I'm using red fabrics, and I also find that it's good to use dark blue if you're using dark blue fabrics, and yellow is another colour that's quite good to match when you can, but generally I use an off-white for most things, or a pale grey will work really well and blend with most fabrics, but I do find red, yellow and blue it's really helpful to colour match if you can. So once you've finished and you've filled in the gaps at the top and also at the bottom, then your panel is ready to be quilted. There are gaps at the sides which I will sort out a little bit later on because I'm going to trim them, because it's only going to require a little bit of trimming. But before you do your quilting, just check that you don't have any hexiform that's popped out of place, because that can happen. And if that does happen, then as you can see here, the seam allowance has just gone underneath the hexiform shape a little bit. So just get your glue pen, push it back in and stick the seam allowance down. So just give a check through, make sure everything's in place, and then you're ready to quilt it. If you've used paper, you'll need to remove your papers before you do this step, and you'll need a layer of wadding. You can use a layer of wadding with Hexiform too, but I don't need that, so I've just got fabric there, and you can choose to pin based or spray based, which is what I chose, as I don't like putting the pins through the very fine Liberty Lawn fabric. And then you'll need to mark your quilting lines. I like to use this Hera marker. You could use a washable fabric pen, it really doesn't matter, and you can either choose to quilt all the way around each hexagon, or you could do straight lines, any way you want really. I'm going to go for a diagonal line going one way and a diagonal line going the other way, so they'll cross in the centre, but you could do more quilting than this if you wish. And of course you can choose hand quilting or machine quilting. I'm going for a machine quilting, and I'm doing it the simplest way because otherwise this video would never get finished because it is a lengthy process. Enjoyable, but it does take time. So I'm just lining my ruler up with the points of the hexagons, making sure that the line of the ruler is in the centre of the hexagons going diagonally, and then I just use the Hera marker to just crease the fabric really and just give me that line to stitch along. Because the fabrics I've used here are quite busy, it is hard to see the line. It is difficult, but trust me, it is there. It was easier to see in real life. So if you are struggling to see a line when you use a Hera marker on busy fabrics, do think about using an air erasable or a water erasable pen, or some sort of chalk. That would work too, tailor's chalk type thing. So once your lines are marked, then you can get stitching, and like I said, just really simple straight lines. You could use a walking foot, and if you're using a layer of wadding, I would definitely recommend that. I found that I didn't need a walking foot because the Hexiform's really stable and I only had a layer of fabric on the back, but definitely use a walking foot if you have one. And yep, the quilting is done, just 2 diagonal lines. And now I'm just trimming those edges on the left and right, and I'm being really careful to make sure I start my trimming a little bit away from the edge so I don't cut into my stitches. So I've just, you can see that little gap there, that ensures that I haven't cut into my stitches. And that's fine because that's going to be in the seam allowance when we sew all of this together to make it into the cushion cover. So I just do that on both sides, just trim the points off basically, get it nice and square. Next you need to measure your piece just to check exactly how big it is. Mine was 15 by 13, so I used this measurement to know how big to cut my back panel. I'm cutting 2 pieces that are 15 by 11, and this is because I'm doing an envelope style back, and I want 2 pieces that overlap, and I want a big overlap so that there's no gaping when you put the cushion pad inside. So the next thing to do is to hem the openings. So I'm hemming the bottom part of one of the pieces and the top of the other, and you'll see what I mean in a minute. I've turned it over by 1/2 inch and 1/2 inch again to enclose the raw edge, but you could do yours differently, it really doesn't matter. Just make sure that you have no raw edge visible. So I place them with the right sides together, and I've put the one that overlaps down from the top underneath first, and then put the other one that comes up on top of that, and I'm going to sew all the way around with a 1/4 inch seam. Now you might want to do this twice just to give it extra stability if it's going to be well used. You can see there is still a raw edge there, so you can choose whether you use the overcast foot on your machine or whether you use an overlocker to seal this raw edge, or you could even bind it, but for the purpose of this video I've just left it raw for now. Most of the inside is nicely encased with that fabric panel over the back of the hexagons anyway. I'm not too worried about the raw edge, but when it comes to washing, especially with this linen, it will be a good idea to have that encased, so I will probably do a bound edge around that. But for this video, I'm just going to leave it how it is. I'm pushing out the corners using the hero marker, it's handy for that. Looks a little bit lumpy bumpy, so give it a nice press, and it looks much better after that. And that's it. Got a nice big overlap, and as you can see the hexagons are covered over with the fabric panel. So time to put the cushion pad inside. This is one I modified from an old cushion, and you just need to plump it and flatten it and mess around with it until you get it exactly how you want it to be, and then it is done. So really simple, really easy. You can make this any size. Just sew your hexagons together and then work from that measurement, and you don't really need to worry about seam allowances because they're already incorporated into it. You're going to lose a 1/4 inch all the way around when you sew the back on, and that's it. So thanks ever so much for watching this tutorial, and I'll see you next week. Thank you so much. Goodbye.